Questions under Standing Order 27, and I call Deputy Billy Kelleher.
Thank you, Lascion Corla. Taoiseach, over 4 years on, we still have no proper rollout of universal access to GPs. This was a stated government policy, and we now find as late as yesterday that it reported 50% of GPs have signed up for the under-6s contract. In some parts of the country, in Tipperary, for example, it's as low as 8%. In parts of Cork City and County, it's 32%, Clare is 29%, and County Louth is 22%. So across the country, large tracts of the country are left without access to GP services for under-6s with the new contract. Now, there's no doubt, Taoiseach, and we didn't oppose the bill of the under-6s, but we did make the case from a very early stage that primary care was simply being under-resourced and starved of funds and resources and services. And we simply have an unsustainable position now where we're finding GP services are beginning to fold across the country. And at the same time, you continue with this pretense that primary care is the stated strategy. Investment in GP services will be the way forward in terms of maintaining people in the community, keeping people out of the acute hospital system. And Taoiseach, it may have passed your notice, but only a couple of weeks ago we had a woman of 102 years of age who lay in a trolley in an emergency department in Tallaght, got a blood transfusion and had to lie in a trolley in a corridor for over 24 hours. Outrageous. That was repeated a number of weeks earlier, same type of circumstance in Limerick. So the point we're making here is that if we are to talk about primary care, if we're talking about investment in primary care, if we're talking about keeping chronic illness and chronic disease in the primary care setting, would you not accept at this stage that the government's policy in terms of the rollout of universal access to GPs for everybody is in rag order, but certainly shambolic from the point of view that it is now 4 years on since he commenced this rollout, and we now have less than half the GPs in the country. But more importantly, we've only half the people of the country who will have access to GP services in the next number of weeks and months. And there's huge uncertainty out there. So could we have clarity in terms of, will the Minister re-engage with those that are not signing the contracts? Will they engage with the National Association of GPs, who represent large bodies of GPs out there who aren't taking up the contracts? And will they give some assurance to parents of children under 6 that they will have the service available to them as stated by the end of next month?
Thank you. First of all, in relation to your reference to very elderly patients being on trolleys for unacceptably long times, I do think that that is an issue which every hospital management has to be alert to, and I know it is the Minister's absolute determination to ensure that those kind of cases should not actually occur. But I just want to sympathise with the people who are affected by that, and indeed with their families. In Tallaght, as you know, there's $5 million being spent on finalising a new emergency department. Also, again, as I'm sure you'll know as health spokesperson, there are very successful urgent assessment units which are now used quite widely. They've been in use in my own local hospital in Blanchardstown now for most of this year, where older people, particularly people maybe over 70 with chronic conditions very often, they can go to those assessment units and be looked after extremely well, and therefore they're taken out of the emergency department situation very, very quickly. And it's a system which works very well, and I understand that Tallaght is actually in the process alongside the work in the emergency department of having essentially an urgent care approach for very elderly patients who come in. In relation to the GP cards and GP care for under 6-year-olds, I have to say I'm very pleased at the level of response so far, which is just over 60%, 50% of the eligible doctors. Clearly this is both a medical and a business decision which doctors and their doctor practices and medical companies, because quite a lot of them nowadays can be medical companies, have to make. And I think very good progress has been made on this. This is something which has been talked about in this country over a very long period of time. And I know, for instance, again, in my own constituency and most of the suburbs of the north and the west side of Dublin, the number of GPs signing up has actually been very good. And that's so important for the families of the children because, as you know, parents will very shortly be able to apply online to register for their GP service for their under-6s with a local medical practitioner. There are, I understand it, specific problems in relation to some areas of the country. I know that while the figures have been extremely high in places like Donegal and the west and north side of Dublin, they have been, at the moment, rather disappointing and lower in places like Tipperary. And as you said yourself, there are some problems in Cork. I believe that all of these problems over time can be addressed. And obviously these are decisions medical practitioners have to make, but I believe the under-6 GP card is good for the health of all our under-6 children. We will be rolling out, of course, the provisions for over 70s the month afterwards, and of course we have ambitions then to extend it further in the programme that I agreed with the Taoiseach after my election to other primary school children and ultimately to all children under 18 years of age.
Deputy Billy Kelleher, supplementary question.
Taoiseach, 50%. If that's your aspiration, well then it's a very poor effort. With regard to the issue of universal access to GPs for everybody, I mean that's a stated policy in the programme for government that was formulated in March 2011. It was stated that everybody in the country would have access to a GP free of charge. Universality across the board. We're now over 4 years in, and we have a situation where, in the first effort to roll out this strategy, less than half, or just half the GPs have signed up. So that means there'll be huge tranches of people who will be discommoded, will not have access to their family GP. And like you had 4 years to negotiate this. And in the 11th hour, we now have a situation where families are unsure of what services will be available to them in the next number of weeks with regard to access to their family doctor. But the broader issue at stake, Minister, is the apologies to the 102-year-old lying on a trolley for 24 hours simply isn't good enough, because apologies will not change the policies that you're pursuing. And what is happening is you're driving people into hospitals because primary care is under-resourced, it's under huge pressure. GPs are referring in because they simply cannot cope with chronic illness and chronic disease. And that is your stated policy, to actually keep people out of the hospital, and everything you do in reverse. Now, I hate to inform you, Taoiseach, but your constituency colleague, the Minister for Health, was doing his usual grand tour of radio stations this morning, waxing lyrically about the observations he was making on health. But he seems to forget that he's the person who's ultimately in charge and responsible. And, the health has been entrusted into him to make some effort to address the problems that are being faced on a daily basis. And the difficulty is it's getting progressively worse. Over 400,000 people are now waiting to see a consultant.
Question,
the stated
please,
aim of reducing trolleys, as the Taoiseach promised in 2011, is now a situation where we have a crisis situation every day in our emergency departments, but you now have an acceptance that anything around 350 or 400 people lying on trolleys is simply okay. That's where we are at, Taoiseach. So the idea that it is all fine out there simply isn't the case. And then the Minister for Health comes in here and tells us that we had a realistic budget last year presented to the Dáil. But he can tell Shane Coleman this evening or today that he needs more beds, he needs more money, and he needs an awful lot more resources. So at the heart of all of this is a lot of disingenuous talk, a lot of nonsense, and a lot of spin. The bottom line is our health services are now in rag order.
Frame a question,
and
please.
Patients are suffering day in, day out. And I shouldn't have to stand up here and raise it. You should know that yourself. All you have to do is look at the trolley figures in the context of Beaumont, Tala, and many other hospitals around the country. And your stated policy was to reduce trolley numbers in our emergency departments, free access to everybody by the end of this year, and simply none of that has been achieved.
You're over
It's
time
a
now,
shameful,
Deputy,
sad
please.
indictment.
Deputy
But
Kelly.
in the context of the GP services, will you commit to giving additional resources to primary care so they can address the problems faced with people having to go to acute hospitals because they can't access treatment in their local communities?
Thank you. Taoiseach.
Well, as you know, the task force in relation to the issue of overcrowding and trolleys in hospitals and ED departments has actually been allocated an additional 74 million to ease the difficulties there. And as I say, no, it's not acceptable to have somebody of an advanced age on a trolley for anything longer than a number of hours. And really, this is something that hospital managements have to address. And I think anybody who's experience of being with an elderly person in the small hours of the night with an elderly person sitting waiting, it's a very, very difficult place and a very worrying place to be in. But what I want to say again, Deputy, is that the additional resources and in particular the development of the urgent assessment units and special access for older people is actually working really well in a number of hospitals right around the country, because the ideal would be that somebody who's of an advanced age with a complex medical history, if they contact the hospital, they should not have to go through the normal emergency section. They should actually be able to go into the urgent assessment units, which are actually working very well. Secondly, in relation to primary care, I agree with you. Primary care is going to be the best basis of the health service in this country and every other country in years to come, because it does achieve the objective of helping to keep people out of hospitals. And if you look at the very, very fine primary healthcare centres which are being built right around the country, in my own constituency, one just opened recently on the Navan Road, fine 3-storey building with diverse primary medical care facilities available. In Corduff, where when you were in government it had been promised for more than a decade during the best period of the boom in Ireland. It was an empty site. It was an empty site with grass growing on it. And I invite you as a health spokesperson to go up and actually see the building, which is probably at the moment 3-storey building, more than 50% complete. And that is what is going to actually deliver primary health care right around this country. Furthermore, for all of those parents, for all of the parents of the 270,000 children, for all of the parents of the 270,000 children who are going to benefit from the GP medical card, it's actually going to, in fact, ensure that those children from birth to 6 years of problem. The outcomes were much less than the outcomes now being achieved. And if you go back to the history of mother and child health care in this country, right back to the period of Dr. Noel Brown and mother and child health care, it has always been necessary and been appropriate indeed to negotiate with GPs. So my message to GPs around the country is to engage with the HSE and to give the 270,000 children and their parents in this country who would benefit from a GP medical card, to give those families and those children the opportunity to improve their health, not just from 0 to 6 years, but because those years are so vital for the rest of their childhood and their adult life.
Now call Deputy Mary Lou MacDonald. Order.
This morning we have learned the very distressing and alarming news that a 19-year-old Dublin teenager has gone on hunger strike in an Egyptian jail. Ibrahim Halawa was born in the Coombe. He went to Holy Rosary National School in Firhouse and then to Rockbrook College in Rathfarnham. He finished his education in the Institute of Education on Leeson Street. He's a Dubliner. Ibrahim has been detained for 2 years now without trial. He was 17 when he was arrested, so he never got to collect his Leaving Cert results. His trial has been postponed on 4 separate occasions, and he's held in an adult prison in an oppressive and cramped cell with 40 other people. Every morning when he wakes, he hears the screams of people being tortured. He himself has been beaten, and the Irish consul in Egypt has witnessed his injuries. He's been denied medical attention. If convicted, Ibrahim faces the very real prospect of life imprisonment. Amnesty International have done considerable work on his case, and they have established beyond any doubt that Ibrahim Halawa is a prisoner of conscience. They firmly believe that he's been detained solely for peacefully exercising his right to freedom of expression and assembly. Taoiseach, what would you do? What would any of us do if this was our child? I believe we would go to hell and back to secure their release. You would be demanding that the Taoiseach pick up the phone and tell the Egyptian Prime Minister to release this Irish citizen. That's in fact what the Australian Prime Minister did to secure the release of journalist Peter Griest, who shared a cell with Ibrahim. He did what any leader would do to protect the rights of a citizen. He intervened directly and decisively and secured the release of Peter Griest. So, Taoiseach, will you join with me today in calling on the Taoiseach to pick up the telephone to the Egyptian Prime Minister and call for the immediate release of Ibrahim?
Thank you.
Will you also tell us whether you agree with Amnesty International that Ibrahim is a prisoner of conscience and that he should be released immediately?
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Deputy for raising the issue. I think anybody who has read about the issue or heard about it on media or who has had an opportunity, as I have had, to meet people with a very deep interest in this case, including in my own case briefly with members of his immediate family. I think all of us want to see Ibrahim Halawa at home and in the bosom of his family in Ireland. We know that he went to Egypt to see his extended family when he was just 17. And of course he was there at a time of the Egyptian Spring, the Arab Spring, when there was a great deal of demonstration and unrest and events. It is regrettable that the Egyptian authorities have not been in a position to process the various legal issues, but I will say that both the Minister for Foreign Affairs, with whom I've discussed the issue, and other ministers, and in particular our ambassador and our consulate staff in Egypt have maintained constant contact with Ibrahim and with the Egyptian authorities to ensure that, notwithstanding the very difficult circumstances he's in, that he is given that the Egyptian authorities are aware of the deep level of concerns in relation to this case in Ireland. The case is and remains a priority for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Officials at the embassy in Cairo are monitoring the case and following the case closely. Ibrahim has received over 40 consular visits since he was first detained, and the most recent visit was earlier this week. As has been the case at all of the hearings in relation to his case, Irish embassy officials from our embassy in Cairo have been in attendance. I understand that the case will possibly come up again on the 2nd of August. In the meantime, the officials in the Department of Foreign Affairs will keep in constant contact. One of the approaches that might help to resolve this is if his bail application could be accepted and of course the Irish government has been happy to support the bail application, and I would certainly use the forum of the Dáil to urge the Egyptian authorities to look at the situation of a teenager visiting, as I say, back in Egypt with his extended family, who got caught up in some of the events happening in Egypt in that time, and who has since been languishing in prison under varying conditions which are of deep concern to everybody. And I want to commend Amnesty International for taking such a close interest in this case, because I think it has to concern all of us that somebody who is an Irish citizen should actually be in this situation. And I have spoken with other members of the government in relation to the case, and I do hope that all of the work that's been done, particularly by our diplomatic officials and through a series of diplomatic channels, will result in Ibrahim being returned safely at home to his family here in Dublin.
Well, the
difficulty, Taoiseach, and the reason why this young man's detention has been so drawn out and so harrowing is, I believe, precisely because the Irish government has not prioritised his safety, his welfare and his return. And just to tell you, because I have been speaking to members of the family, they are not convinced, nor are they satisfied that the Irish government has acted fully and appropriately to secure the safety and the freedom of one of our citizens. So, to visit on 40 occasions might sound like an impressive statistic from the Irish system, but sure, you could visit him 140 times. That's not worth a candle to the young man if he continues to be detained in an Egyptian prison. I asked you two very specific questions, Taoiseach, and you sidestepped both of them. I asked you to join with me in calling on the Taoiseach to make direct contact with the Egyptian Prime Minister and to demand the release of Ibrahim. That's what I asked from you, because it's only that level of intervention, it seems, that will work in this case. I asked you a second question, which was not to commend Amnesty International, but to accept the findings of Amnesty International on the floor of the Dáil and acknowledge that Ibrahim is in fact a prisoner of conscience. And unless we have that level of decisive thinking and decisive action from government, this traumatic situation will drag on and on.
Thank you,
Ibrahim's mother visits him every week. Since his detention, she moved to Egypt, obviously Egypt to be close to her son. She has no contact on those visits. She sees her son behind wires. She can't comfort him, console him, give him a hug. The family at this stage are absolutely distraught and concerned for his physical safety, his physical health, and indeed his mental health. And things are now at a stage where this young man has undertaken a hunger strike. His life is in the balance. And we have an Irish government that has been at best tepid in their approach to securing his safety and his freedom. What is needed here is the direct intervention of An Taoiseach. I am calling on him to lift the phone today, to contact the Egyptian Prime Minister today, and to state categorically that we demand the release of our citizen, of Dublin man Ibrahim Halawa.
Thank you,
I
Deputy.
want you to do likewise, Taoiseach, and I do not wish you to equivocate or to fudge the issue. This is far too serious at this point for that.
Taoiseach.
Well, I want to thank you for your concern about Ibrahim. But in fact, if you want to see Ibrahim being released, I think it doesn't help the case that you would disregard the work that has gone on by Irish officials on a continuous basis. It's very easy for you to come in here and on almost any issue to scoff, and to scoff at the work of the officials. You scoff at the idea that the officials have visited Ibrahim 40 times. I actually think that doesn't become you, because I don't know whether you're familiar with how the legal system and the political system may work in Egypt, but I can tell you that our officials,
Order, please.
have worked extremely hard, and that last week the Minister for Foreign Affairs and the Taoiseach met at length with members of the family and went through the details of the case in great detail with the family. Clearly, perhaps after that they met, or perhaps beforehand they met with yourself, from what you're saying. And all I can say is that I think everybody in Ireland is deeply concerned about the position that this young man finds himself in, and we want to see him home in Dublin. We have a foreign affairs service so as to have a resolution to this kind of extremely distressing case. And as I said, I commend amnesty, and I want to see our government continue its work in detail in terms of having this young man released. If you want me to actually enter into negotiations here on the floor of the Dáil, I want to focus on getting this young man released. You have other ideas. I want to concentrate on what will actually see the young man released. I don't know whether you accept that Egypt is a country with a separate government and legal systems, and as a separate country, there has to be some respect for the legal processes of that country. And that is what we're doing.
Sorry.
It's not a petition. Crane didn't pick up the phone over the last 40 years.
Please.
The gravity of this situation. Yeah. I have to insist that the Taoiseach answer the question.
No.
The reality is that what secured the release of an Australian citizen was direct contact. Prime Minister to Prime Minister. And I have to ask
Deputy. No, Chair is on his feet. Yeah, Chair is on his feet. Chair is on his feet, please. I guess. I have to ask you to resume your seat, please. I have to call the next speaker, which is from the technical group, Deputy Sullivan. And just to say, Deputy, there have been questions, there have been supplementaries, there have been replies. If you're not happy, you have to take those up with the Cairn Corley's office. Deputy Sullivan. Please. Could we have, could we have order? Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan. Please.
On May.
Deputy O'Sullivan has the floor, please. Please. Deputy O'Sullivan. Sorry. Look, please. I want order, please, now. Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan, I've called.
Right, thank you, Margaret Cairn Corley. Tánaiste, on May the 14th last, my leader's question with you was about children, and it was about the devastating effects on some of our children who are living in inappropriate accommodation because of the devastating effects of successive housing policies or lack of housing policies. And I was looking particularly at children in direct provision and children who are living in B&Bs and hotels. 1 week later, there were 2 reports came out that confirmed what I was saying. There was a HICWA report which showed 14% of children of asylum seekers living in direct provision who were not safe. They were exposed to domestic violence, physical abuse and isolation. The Ombudsman for Children's Office, their report showed that in 2008, 6.8% of children were living in consistent poverty, but today 11.7%, which translates into 138,000 children. The quote I would take from that report is that the government is tolerating unacceptable levels of child poverty, and that the B&B accommodation impacts negatively on family life and children's development. Last week we had a report from the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commissioner, and in an article she was asking, how is the government going to explain, how is it going to defend the increased poverty rates that we're seeing, and why many groups already susceptible to poverty and inequality were disproportionately affected by the recession, and children are part of that group. And I can't but be struck by what I've said here now and aspects that came out during the debate on the Commission of Investigation. And one of them was the write-down 110 million, or no, it was 119 million. And that 9 million discrepancy was bandied about as if it were €9. And there was no doubt that there was preferential treatment for the privileged few, but the reality for those who suffered really vicious cuts is very different, and housing is one of the casualties. Now, in your reply on the 14th, you gave me various answers to the housing issue. But in the meantime, all of the homeless charities are seeing families living in these unsuitable and risky places. And there's also a fear that children will be joining the numbers of rough sleepers. Now, we know the problems. HAP was presented as one of the solutions, but again the homeless charities are saying that there are areas where HAP won't work because HAP was supposed to match market value. We did have another answer around rent control, rent management. What is happening with that? And the other aspect is we do have examples of international best practice, and Holland is one example where we have landlords who want to get into the private rented market, and I'm asking, has that been looked at? But I think my question generally is about where is the urgency to address the crisis?
Thank you. Taoiseach.
Well, as I previously mentioned in this House, I actually met myself at length last week with a number of the organisations dealing with and addressing and working very hard on issues in relation to homelessness. And I want to use this opportunity just to stress again that if there is anybody out there, whether with children or not, but obviously particularly families with children, who have difficulties around either their rent or their tenancy and fear that they may be at risk of homelessness, I want them to contact their local Intrio social welfare office and to seek an appointment with the Community Welfare Service. Because at this point in time, we have now dealt under the protocol that we operate with organisations like Threshold, Simon and Focus Point. We now operate on a countrywide basis a very extensive one-to-one service with our officials and in cooperation with local authorities to actually help people who have a risk of becoming homelessness, or who have a difficulty with renegotiating their rent or their tenancy. And I just want to say, Deputy O'Sullivan, that the protocol is working extremely well. We have extended it right around the country now, so it's available right around the country. It's working, I think, very, very well in Cork because, again, of the dedication of both the public servants operating the system and, indeed, of the voluntary organisations, particularly in the case of Cork, the work of Simon and of other organisations in seeking to access accommodation for people. So I just want to use this opportunity to stress again to all the members in this House that that service is available and it can actually respond extremely quickly. But it does mean that people have to actually go and utilise the service. We send out where we have, for instance, where we have mobile phone numbers, and we have those in a lot of cases. We send out regular texts to people to remind them that if they have a difficulty with housing, if they contact the Community Welfare Service in their local area, their local Intrio office, that they will receive help and advice, and we've done that now with a large number of cases. In relation then to the overall issue of housing supply, the only way, Deputy, that is going to be addressed is by increasing the number of houses being built and the number of houses available to the local authorities. Unfortunately, under the previous government, the building of local authority accommodation pretty much came to a standstill because the policy of that of particularly the last government of the Greens and of Fianna Fáil was in fact to rely almost entirely on the private sector. We are now moving, as you will know, to put in extensive amounts of capital into the local authorities. In Dublin alone, we're now making, I'm happy to say, very good progress on reopening the boarded up, voided properties, and I'm sure you're familiar with that Dublin City Council is now producing far more opened up accommodation which has been renewed and refurbished so that families, and there is a priority there at the moment for families who have issues around homelessness to in fact be dealt with as quickly as possible by the local authority. But it is going to take us some time to come to terms with all of the different elements of the housing crisis, and Minister Kelly will be bringing proposals to Cabinet shortly in relation to areas around rent certainty.
Thank you. Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan. Sorry, could we have order, please?
If I could just give some statistics from some of the housing organisations. In Q1 of 2015, one homeless group worked with 116 homeless children in Dublin, and that was an 87% increase on the 62 children that they worked with in Q1 of 2014. Another organisation tell me that their view is that while they're waiting for those initiatives to make progress, that 70+ children will become homeless every month. Now, with others, with Deputy Collins here, I was outside yesterday at the lone parent families protest outside. They make up 60% of the families in emergency accommodation, and in July a further 30,000 one-parent households are going to be affected by the last phase of the one-parent family payment reform. So there's real concerns from the housing organisations that that's going to push lone parents further from the workforce and expose them to a higher risk of homelessness. Now, we know that social housing is a major part of the answer, but it's reckoned again the plan to build 1,700 social housing units by 2017. That's going to provide 2% of the housing needed from those currently on the social housing list, and that social housing list is being added to all the time. Focus Ireland had an email campaign recently, and I think there were some 4,000 emails were sent to the Taoiseach. And the emails were about certain aspects, about rent certainty, about increasing the rent supplement to reflect the market value. But it was also a call that when a family are assessed by the local authority as being homeless, that at that point the local authority must provide a place to stay until more suitable accommodation is available, and that they are resourced to do that. Now, the Taoiseach did not reply to that, but I'm asking for your response to that this becomes the urgent matter that it is. Some of us are in constituencies that are particularly affected by this, and I know your own is one of those. But as we can make other issues urgent, why not the housing issue?
Thank you. Taoiseach, to conclude.
Well, I've had an opportunity to meet recently, as I said, with the various organisations. I think some of the statistics that you quoted, unfortunately, because of the general disturbance in front of you and some of it behind me, I couldn't hear everything that you said properly. But I understand they're the statistics, or some of them were the ones that I discussed with Focus Point and their new CEO and a delegation from Focus Point who came in to see me. And yes, those statistics are very worrying. And what we have to do is to get all of the different authorities to come together, particularly Dublin City Council, to open up more than the 1,000 closed-up properties which were there. They've been given the funds to refurbish them. I know there's builders anxious to go and work on them. And the key thing is that we get those opened up. And as you say, those families will have a degree of priority in relation to those. All those arrangements have been made with the local authorities. So the key thing is to see that families get those. In relation, by the way, to social welfare payments, and I think you were referring to the UN committee hearings that were held earlier this week. I'm sure that you do know that because of social welfare transfers, social welfare payments to families, in fact, we have the largest reduction of the at-risk of poverty because of the strength of our social welfare system. And our social welfare system is not only strong, but it's my intention to make it stronger. And part of the strength of the social welfare system is that nowadays it helps families to actually get into work, whether those families are in a one-parent situation or whether there are two parents in the family. And that has been a passion of mine since I first became involved in politics. It's very good to have a strong social welfare system, and that's what I've been doing as Minister for Social Protection, ensuring strong social protection in this country. But it's actually even better if you can also get a well-paid job that will pay you well and that will give you greater financial independence. And in the changes that are happening at the moment, very significant numbers of people will benefit between 50 euros and 150 euros a week in additional earnings. Now, that might not sound like a lot of money to people in here on a TD's salary, but for a family, it's a very significant amount. And what we are doing again, as with the housing protocol, and this has been going on, by the way, in the department for the last 3 years, and already 19,000 families in the previous 2 years have transited. What it is a one-on-one interaction. And if any of those families have housing issues as well, when they go in to meet the employment officer, they can also go and meet the community welfare service, so that we can really, that it's not just simply a kind of a distant situation as happened in the past, where if somebody went on lone parents, the expectation often was that they might stay in it for 22, 30 years. What we want to do now is offer a service, and with all of the families who have been coming in to see us, the outcomes have been extremely positive. And perhaps, when time permits, we'll arrange for some of the deputies who are interested in this to go and actually visit and see the system in the social welfare offices of people being involved in really positive engagements about how to provide a better future for themselves and for their children.
Thank you, Taoiseach. That concludes leaders' questions. And now we go on to the order of business.